advancing because it's science, so therefore it's important, without the appropriate cautions and risk are obviously also heightened. So we're super delighted to today kick off the inaugural Future of Privacy Forum Award for Research Data Stewardship with the input and support of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. I'm really delighted to have not only the awardees here with me today, but Daniel Goroff, whose partnership and thinking about how to advance this challenging issue. How do we ensure that administrative data, that corporate data, that data that is increasingly not collected in the standard limited ways that data has been available for research, but the broader scope of data that is out there, that is necessary and available, is increasingly important and increasingly available. So I want to thank Danny and the entire Sloan team for their thinking, their ideas. And Danny, let me turn to you as you reconnect to audio and video. I think we have him back. It wouldn't be a conference. Danny, you are back at the exact right time, because I was just going to introduce you and let you share a little bit more about how this came about, your bigger picture interest in making sure that data protection and science are advanced, and some of your thinking about why this is something that's been important to the Sloan Foundation.
Well, how's that? A little better?
All
okay.
set.
All right. Thank you. And thanks so much, Jules, and thanks to everybody at the Future of Privacy, forum for all the work putting this together, and it's really a terrific event. So I hope that everyone here knows that Alfred P. Sloan was the gentleman who put together and ran General Motors. So he was a great corporate leader, and he's remembered today for starting Memorial Sloan Kettering, and for the Sloan School of Management at MIT, and for starting the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation with the instructions that we should fund research breakthroughs in science, technology, and economics. A lot of the best of that work these days is just increasingly depends on using administrative data. And by that, I mean data that was not originally collected for research purposes. So that might mean a lot of transactions data or other information that's been gathered either by public or by the private sector. So the safe and responsible access to that data is really vital for science and for society and for the kind of research that the Sloan Foundation funds. I, for one, really don't want to live in a world where only a few institutions either know or think that they know what's going on. So there's a great potential here for mutual benefit. And it's not just about publishing journal articles, but it's also about bringing academic rigor and academic attention to making progress on the great social issues of our day. And I just believe that companies should get credit for figuring out how to make win-win data sharing arrangements like this really work. And that's why the Sloan Foundation is a very proud sponsor of this award.
Danny, I think it's interesting, for a kind of privacy organization to be applauding what is, in essence, data sharing. But I think one of the reasons why we thought this really makes sense is that privacy is more than keeping data private and limited and proprietary. If we care about how people are affected differently by COVID, if we care about how different communities are served differently, ignoring data or hiding the data or not having the details ends up with disparities. At the end of the day, the point of data protection is to ensure that the rights and freedoms of people are protected. The GDPR, the European data protection legislation, which is viewed in some ways as a gold standard, doesn't talk about privacy. It talks about data protection in support of the rights and freedoms of the individual. And so if privacy at the end of the day is about power, the decisions we make about who is in and who is out are incredibly impacted by who has that power. That doesn't mean data goes. If data goes anywhere, obviously, we've undermined the entire point. But ensuring that careful data protection and ethical review processes are in place so that the legitimate, societally useful uses of data go, and the ones that we don't want to see happen are constrained by law and practice and policy. And so I think that's one of the sort of perspectives that we bring to it. It's easy to say there's privacy risks, so don't do it. One of our goals in being involved in championing this award is to recognize that both alternatives allow data to flow freely because somebody can study it or there's benefit, and locking it down and having it be of only use to one entity, or both in many cases unacceptable. And that the right balance for society, as almost all of our rights and freedoms need to be balanced against each other and integrated, right, with each other in a cohesive way that supports democratic society. So that was really our source of excitement in being able to advance and recognize really that integration. And that's not easy. It puts burden, it puts risk, but when done thoughtfully and well, I think deserves the applause and certainly the emulation by others to support scientific inquiry with that noble passion. So I'll let Danny respond.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, absolutely, there are many who will tell you that there are privacy risks, so don't do it. I think a lot of those people just might be lawyers. I'm not sure. But I would say that there are privacy risks and there are social rewards. And some of the rewards that come from the kind of research that can be done with this are also really huge. So do it, but be careful. And honoring people who figure out how to do that carefully in a way that society can benefit from, that's what we're here for.
Well, without further ado, then let me ask Dr. Sarah Jordan, who has helped lead this effort on the academic side here and helped lead the review process, to take over and discuss the competitive effort. We did receive a fair number of very strong proposals and really did a deep review with a broad committee. And let Sarah give you a little bit of an overview of that review process, and then she'll introduce our awardees.
Great. Thanks, Jules. Thanks, Danny. So thank you for everyone for joining us this afternoon. I really appreciate you being here. I hope that this is something that you get to take some information away from as we traverse through this program. So you may be wondering how it is that we came to the decision to award this to our present winners. Well, last autumn, somewhere between November and January, we solicited nominations, whether or not through direct outreach or the FPF website. And we asked people to tell us about their research data sharing practices. We asked not only the corporate side, but also the research side to self-nominate or to nominate others that they considered to be engaging in privacy protective, data protective forms of research data sharing. We took in a tremendous number of inquiries. At last count this afternoon, over 110 organizations asked us about this award. Finally, we received in the tens of numbers of nominations, and we pushed those to a select committee of 8 individuals who helped us to comb carefully through these nominations to try to determine, well, what were their privacy practices? How well was data security protected? What was the research question that was being asked and answered? How closely did the researcher and the data sharing organization collaborate? Well, as I'm sure many of you here are aware of, reviewing anything is difficult, and sometimes really reviewing excellent protocols can be even worse than reviewing those things that are bad. What we found was that our 8 reviewers, had an incredibly tough time. We went back and forth a number of different instances to try to identify our final winners. They had a difficult time because we had such excellent proposals. We had nominations that spanned the spectrum of data sharing, everything from what you're going to hear about this afternoon to sharing things like location data and social media data for different forms of research, whether or not social scientific research, computer science research, or even secondary medical research. So we were really pleased with the tremendous number of inquiries and final applications we had, but we were really enlightened and really heartened to find that there was such a broad spectrum of possibility for data sharing out there. But ultimately, we were very pleased to have finally come to the decision that we would be awarding this award for research data stewardship to Lumos Labs, represented today by General Manager Bob Schaefer, and Professor Mark Stivers of the University of California, Irvine, Department of Cognitive Sciences. So welcome and thank you so much for your work on your application. Thank you so much for your dedication to these processes, both Bob and Mark. Welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, gentlemen, I do believe we've had the chance to send you an award. Do you happen to have that with you? Could you show our worldwide audience what we've gotten over to you? Brilliant. Thank you. All right. Thanks, Mark. Thanks, Bob. I really appreciate you both highlighting that. And for those of us, you in the audience, I'm sure what you're really waiting to hear is what they do, right? Why do we have these two gentlemen with us today? So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to both Bob and Mark, and we're going to have a bit of a discussion about research data sharing and about the research practices. And Mark, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you. You're the one that took that data from, and something inert and turned it into something that we can do more with. So tell us more about your research using Lumos Labs data. What was your motivation for partnering with Lumos Labs?
Sure. I can talk a little bit about the project that we worked on. So I'm a cognitive scientist. I'm interested in understanding how people learn. In the past, we've used laboratory studies where we bring in people to the lab. These are typically small numbers of participants from a very narrow demographic, usually college undergrads, who come in for one session, maybe 2 sessions, where we train them up on some cognitive task and see how well they do, see how well they, how well they learn over time. And we've learned a lot from laboratory studies on, how people learn and improve. But these are very small scale studies. So when I learned about Lumosity and the scale of the data that they had, I was really intrigued with the opportunity to, try to work with them, maybe get access to their data. There were a lot of questions there. How does this process work? And I'll say a little bit about the process in a moment, but after a whole lot of back and forth, we received an amazing data set. And this included data from many different users from the Lumosity platform, where people train on various cognitive tasks. And they train not just on one task, they train on many different tasks. They don't train for just a few sessions, but sometimes over years they're on this platform. And this is the scale of data that we're just not used to thinking about in academia. And then finally, another very intriguing aspect of Lumosity data is that they cover many different demographics. So not just the young sort of college undergrads that we typically test, but also the older demographic, which sometimes we do study it in the lab, but they're difficult. It's often costly, effortful to get an older demographic to work with. And here we sort of had this natural access to many of the older users. And then for the paper that we eventually published in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, we did this project where we analyzed how people performed in this one Lumosity task called Ebb and Flow. It's a task switching game where you constantly have to switch between one set of instruction and another set of instruction. It's a little frustrating at first because it's effortful to switch between tasks. And in the literature, we already knew that older people have a harder time switching between tasks than younger people. That's a well-known finding. You know, as you age, there's cognitive slowing. Every task, you're just a little bit slower than a younger person. But what we found using the scale of Lumosity data is that when an older user trains over a very large period of time, we're talking about weeks, months, years, they can catch up to the performance of a younger user who's relatively untrained. So it's not that you magically become as good as a 20-year-old, you become as good maybe as a 20-year-old who hasn't trained all that much. That was a new insight that was not reported in the literature before, and the only way in which we could have learned that is to use the scale of the Lumosity data. And I can comment more about the process, but maybe this is where Bob can come in and give his perspective.
Yeah, so let me follow on something that you just said there, Mark. So you said that you guys had a long back and forth between one another in order to be able to get access to this data. So Bob, you know, as you and Mark would have had to work together for some time now, this is something that you've done with a number of other researchers from our previous conversations. Can you tell me a little bit more about your motivation or the Lumos Labs motivation to share data with people, with researchers like Mark?
Yeah, absolutely. So at Lumos Labs, we have a program called the Human Cognition Project, or HCP, and that's been our platform for supporting outside research. And actually, this program has been around for years, and primarily toward the beginning, we were supporting a lot of laboratory studies. So we would give access to our software for people to use as part of their experiments. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Lumos Labs or Lumosity, Lumosity is a brain training platform. So it's available on the web and through mobile apps. We also have cognitive assessments. And so we provide access to the software to qualified researchers who want to use this in their studies. But in the last few years, we've accumulated this enormous and really unique data set. And so we've actually put more emphasis on sharing of the data with qualified researchers. We know that this is an invaluable resource and very unique. And so if we can get it in the hands of the right people in the right ways with data privacy in mind, we think that this can be exceptionally impactful. And so through the Human Cognition Project, we try to accomplish a couple different things. One is we're interested in investing here because we believe it will help us create better products. So the more that can be known about cognitive training, cognitive assessment, about these different cognitive tasks, and just the brain and the mind in general, we believe that that can help us develop better software and better products. And also, we truly believe that having more interest in the cognitive sciences, both in the research community and also in the general public, just more interest in the mind and the brain is a good thing. We believe that it makes people more interested in finding unique ways that they can understand the ways that they think. And so there's a lot of alignment here. I think that this is a great case where doing good research and having good business outcomes, those are one and the same. And so whenever you can find a place where it's aligned in that way, I think it's a great place to be. For this specific project, we evaluate proposals for projects on a few different criteria. One of them is the study design or the analysis plan, and actually, so Mark here is an expert at the methods, and his collaborators as well were experts in this domain, and so it was a very strong plan. We believed that there was a high likelihood of conducting good research and a good potential for impacting the field. And then another factor that we look at is Lumosity the right fit for the researcher's needs? And in this case, I think it was the perfect fit. The type of approach that was being proposed really could only be done with a very large data set, like Mark said. And so it ended up being kind of a slam dunk in terms of a proposal. It did require a lot of back and forth, and I can describe that more later. I think just for transparency, we're still trying to figure out the best way to make this work. And one of those places is, you have this trade-off we want to be providing the minimal amount of data to answer a research question so that we can keep good data privacy ideals in mind. And at the same time, sometimes from the research perspective, you need to actually explore the data a little bit before you can understand the shape of it and understand what to do with it. And so trying to find that balance between this principle of minimum amount of data necessary and, well, give me a little bit so I can actually understand what's there. That was the nature of a lot of those conversations, to really sort out what would be needed to answer these questions.
That's interesting. So we'll definitely get it further into the weeds on talking about how to address some of those questions. But I wanted to send a question back to Mark real quick. So obviously you've probably done more than the one paper from the proceedings in the National Academy of Sciences. What else has come out of your work with Lumos Labs data, whether or not in this particular data set or in other interactions?
Yeah, we published so far 3 papers. So the very first paper that was interesting. So in the Lumosity platform, users, they train on whatever task they want to train on. It's their choice to train on tasks that they find engaging or helpful, and they train whenever it suits their time and schedule. And so if they're bored or done with training for the day, they're just stop and they come back whenever it's convenient for them. That's very different from laboratory studies, where we as the researchers, we dictate when our participants come in, and everybody's on the same schedule. You train for the same amount of time. And so we were interested in understanding, how do these choices that people make about training, how does that interact with their learning? And we found that the people who quit early, or the people who decide to train more, they are on a different learning trajectory from each other. So previously in the learning sciences, we were just thinking about, okay, so every time you come in, you have some incremental improvement in your performance. But now we all of a sudden have to think about the choices that people make, about when to train and when to stop. So that was one interesting paper. The other interesting paper that we worked on was a direct collaboration with Bob on analyzing people's learning across different tasks. So it's known in psychology that if you're good in one task, you tend to be good at other tasks as well. But what we didn't know is how does your learning in one task correlate with learning in another task? And we found that people who are good in sort of improving in one task, they're good in improving in other tasks. There's this sort of general learning ability that shows up across users on the Lumosity platform. So it's again that using that scale of the Lumosity data that allows us to go into new questions that couldn't be answered before.
That's fascinating that you've been able to take this data set and use it in so many different ways and so many different path-breaking papers. So let me pitch a question over to Bob in terms of more about this interaction. And it sounds like, from what Mark just said, that you guys have spent quite a bit of time working together on some of these projects. But so let's imagine that we have some researchers in our audience right now. What advice might you have for other academic researchers who may want to start working with Lumos Labs data sets? So for example, you mentioned something about fit. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So, I think what it comes down to, the top piece of advice that I would have is really identify what are the novel aspects or the affordances that you would get for working with a particular data set that you wouldn't get elsewhere. And I'll echo a few things that Mark already touched on, but I think in the case of the Lumosity data set, the nature of the data set means that you can answer questions that have a longitudinal aspect. So Mark pointed out that many people are on this platform over the course of years. That's something that's very difficult to do in a lab data set or in a lab environment. Understanding dynamics related to learning or practice. So again, because people are using Lumosity for a long period of time, you can actually look at changes over time in a way that might be difficult with a lab experiment. And then the size of the data set means that you can investigate rare events. So in the case of cognitive tasks, someone might make an error only rarely with some task that is relatively easy, but there might be something very interesting there to gather enough evidence or enough data on these errors or other rare events can be very difficult through traditional means, but when you have a large data set, it allows you to investigate those. Studying individual differences, Mark pointed out that a lot of studies, a lot of papers that are out there in cognitive psychology use a bunch of college-age psych students who kind of signed up to be participants in a study as part of their Psych 101 class, and so to understand what are these differences when you look at a much larger population and you're able to kind of drill down into differences between individuals. There are very interesting stories there. Also, studying things that might have a small effect size but are quite interesting. So if you think about the impact of sleep or nutrition or exercise or some of these other factors, these are going to be relatively small effect sizes, so it's tougher to do with a small study population. But when you suddenly have millions or tens of millions, or in our case now over 100 million people, then you can actually get some insight into these questions. So these are some specific examples, but I think the more general point is understand what the data set can allow you to do that you wouldn't be able to do otherwise, and kind of tailor the analysis that you want to do around these specific affordances. That would be my general advice.
Great, thanks. So let me ask you a follow-on question that takes us a little bit away from the characteristics of the data to a little bit about the process that you used in order to take the data of hundreds of millions of people, which is fascinating, and turn it into something that is at that minimum size necessary to help Mark and his team to answer the questions that they have. So what sort of steps did you take to help to protect the data, to address privacy in preparing this data for Mark's use?
Right, and I think that this process really goes all the way from the moment you would be thinking about collecting the first piece of data all the way to the moment that it ends up in Mark's hands. And so there are a lot of different steps here. And I just want to point out that actually this process is something that we've been refining over the years. And we have a great a lawyer. We've got a general counsel who is both risk averse and also very good at helping us think through everything here, and good IT managers, and just the research team that actually runs the Human Cognition Project. This is the work of many people from across disciplines. So for one, we have an internal information security policy, as do most companies, and that governs topics like how we classify confidential information, and systems and device management, access control, so things like this. So this is at the very level of our systems and how we're collecting data. What are the policies that we're following? And then once we actually have the data and we're talking to a research collaborator about potentially sharing that data, we put into place a data sharing agreement for each data collaboration, and it's tailored to the specific questions that are being asked. And this is another place that can be a potential pitfall, but I'm happy to say that even the universities that we work with that have kind of the pickiest legal departments, we tend to be able to get to a good place with them. So the data sharing agreement just keeps everybody on the same page about what the expectations are around use of the data. The de-identification of the data, this starts by not collecting personally identifiable information in the first place if we can avoid it. And so actually this is one of the places where our general counsel is very helpful. If we have some proposal and it actually involves collecting more PII than would be necessary, he'll push back, and I think that's a great thing. We just want to avoid having more personally identifiable information in our systems than we need. And then we follow de-identification procedures to try to minimize the risk of anyone re-identifying the data that we share. And so there are safe harbor methods that describe some good de-identification practices. And then as the collaboration is ongoing, I think just those continual updates and check-ins. And I'd say that, you know, Mark, when we talk during the process of a collaboration or as the collaboration is ongoing, it's rarely specifically about data privacy. It's usually more about how the project is going. But I think having those continual check-ins is very important because we can understand whether everyone's on the same page about the use of the data and whether things are going as they were originally intended. And so through those steps, I guess that was, you know, an information security policy, data sharing agreements, de-identification procedures, continual check-ins. You put all those together and you kind of have this end-to-end process for thinking about data privacy for these research collaborations.
Wow, that sounds really involved. And it sounds as if you guys did engage quite a bit with one another throughout this project. So Mark, back over to you in terms of the researcher side. So knowing firsthand what it means to work with these large scale data sets, what advice might you have for other researchers who are trying to use company data, whether or not through something like Lumos Labs or other organizations?
I would say my biggest advice is be patient. And try to educate yourself in terms of the, or put yourself in the shoes of the company. So I think it was fair to say I was a little naive about this process at first. One reason why we approached Lumosity, and Bob, you might not notice, the main reason why we approached you is you had this little form on your webpage that says, if you want to work with us, fill out this form. Most companies don't have such forms, right? They seem completely unapproachable. And for a lot of academic researchers, they don't even want to bother, you know, approaching a company because they think the barriers are so high. But because of that form, you had some kind of process in place to start that conversation. So we filled out the form, and we filled out sort of our thoughts about the data that we thought were going to help us. And I think, yeah, I was a little naive in terms of the work that would be involved in getting that data to us. I thought, okay, somebody's going to fetch the data from some large database, and then my headache is just to work with this, you know, gigabytes of data. But this was an ongoing conversation with, you know, initially with data scientists who had to figure out what exactly we need, where is this data? And this took a lot of effort. The data that we requested was of a particular nature. It was stored in some other servers that are usually not accessible. And I had to be educated on some of the difficulties of preparing this data set. And also, yeah, understanding what's even there. What are the fields? What fields are definitely not accessible, and what can we get? So I would say, yeah, my advice to other academic researchers: stay on it, be patient, and yeah, work with the people there. This is not a simple process. Yeah, and it's totally worthwhile. So this is the best collaboration I've ever had. So yeah.
Great. So Bob, what if I sent that question back over to you as well? So you, as Mark just elaborated, have a very useful form that allows people to say, hey, you know, there's a chance here. But what advice do you have for researchers who are trying to say, are interested in working with you, or for other companies who are also hoping to take a more sort of approachable posture to data sharing?
Yeah, so maybe I'll answer those two separately for researchers and then for other companies. For researchers, Mark, I thought that was a great one. Patience is something that I had not thought of, but that's that's very helpful. And I think this goes to the point, or this might be related to the point that I raised earlier, which is, you know, in most cases, I think good data privacy and good research are not coming in conflict with each other. The principles for each are either in alignment or they're kind of orthogonal to each other. One place where they might come into conflict is that from the research perspective, you just want the bigger the data set, the better, the more fields, you know, bigger is better, just get it over to me and I can work with it. And from a data privacy perspective, really it's the opposite. It's let's figure out the minimal amount of data. Let's figure out how to scale everything way down. And so we haven't solved that perfectly. And right now that means that patience is required. We need to have a lot of those conversations. We internally need to make sure that we are drawing our data from different data stores that have different, let's say, access rules and things like that. And so, you know, there are a handful of different things that need to happen for us to actually arrive at a data set to be delivered. So I thought that was a great response. Patience is a good one. For companies who might be interested in doing either more collaborations with academic groups or starting to have collaborations with academic groups, we've shifted a bit over the years in our approach. So we do have this form, and I'm happy to hear that that has actually been successful, that people come across the form and are happy to fill it out. We've also been taking steps toward more active outreach. And I think, you know, if we go back to, I was describing what we see as some of the biggest, you know, affordances of the Lumosity data set. And based on those, we've actually created, you know, lists of who are some researchers in the field who might be able to do amazing things with the data because of these different aspects of the data set. And we need to educate these people because they don't know that the data set exists. And if they know that it exists kind of theoretically, they don't know the specifics. They don't know which data fields are available. They don't know, they don't know how they would be able to receive this. And so I think just education is a big part of it. So make that short list of people, you know, your dream list of people who would be able to do incredible things with your data, and talk to them and start those conversations. And it might require a lot of back and forths, but you'll learn a lot as you have those conversations. You'll learn a lot what's on the mind of the researchers. You know, for this particular collaboration, so I'm representing the corporate side of the collaboration right now, but I was trained as a neuroscientist, and so I just get extremely excited about this in general. And so I've loved working with Mark, even those conversations along the way that to some might feel tedious because you're trying to get at exactly which data fields are necessary. I've enjoyed them because they involve a lot of the science as well, just understanding what do you need to be able to investigate something in a particular way. And I think they've been fun conversations.
Great, thanks, Bob. So we are taking in a lot of questions, either through the chat or the Q&A, but I wanted to ask that question about how is it that companies can be more approachable from the researcher perspective, back over to Mark. So you mentioned the, you know, useful form. What else, what other advice would you give for those who are on the corporate side who are joining us this afternoon, beyond, you know, have a good form?
Yeah, maybe, I don't know how feasible this is, but maybe have more visibility at some conferences. So some of the bigger companies, they come to, you know, Google, Amazon, Facebook, they're present at various computer science conferences. Mm-hmm. But I think at a slightly smaller scale, some of the companies might not know that there are people who are working on, you know, on the academic side on some problems that need to be solved on the industry side. So maybe that would help. We've, you know, the conferences that I've been involved with, sometimes we try to invite industry to give presentations. That's been helpful. But I suspect there might be a better way to connect academic researchers with industry. I don't know what that format should be, but I think there's a lot of potential there. There's a lot of unawareness of what data is available, what academic researchers could do what. Right? I think there's a way to, improve that synergy.
Sarah, if I can
Yes.
jump in on that, because this has been an interesting topic for us for a number of years as well, because this issue of, you know, do you have a connection at that company and you went to school with that CEO, so you get data, someone else doing equally important, maybe even more important research, you know, doesn't have that networking relationship or couldn't go to that conference. So, you know, Danny's been a champion of, you know, administrative data co-ops or centers where data might be, you know, aggregated. It sounds like this data might be a bit too bespoke to be part of sort of a broad data set, although maybe not. So I wonder what reaction, you know, you'd have to can you see taking maybe some subset of data that could be of value to a broad number of researchers who could replicate Mark's work, right, and improve on it or disagree or debate in the way, right, scientific progress, occurs. Or if this data set is, too sort of particular to the process that you had to do to really make it usable, is there value in some centralized, listing of, the kinds of data sets with some level of detail so that the academics who are, researching cognitive sciences, know that there are multiple data sets and here's the intake and, here's how you can post maybe what you're looking for. It doesn't seem like it doesn't like that exists today. So wonder whether this is a useful idea. It's certainly something that some of us have been thinking about.
Yes, I think I have a couple comments on that, and Mark, I bet you do as well. So one thing to note is actually the data sets that are related to the projects that Mark has done, they are now available through the Open Science Framework. And so, and actually I should have mentioned this at the beginning, Mark, I think at the beginning of the collaboration, you pointed out that if you were to publish, especially if you were to publish in the journal that you had hoped, that it might be a requirement to share the data set more publicly. And, would we be okay with that? And I thought it was terrific to have that conversation at the beginning rather than at the end when you've already got a result and actually want to have it published the next day or the next month. And so that is something that we thought about deeply from the very beginning in this case. We've talked a lot about other data sets that we might make publicly available, even in more of a proactive way. So not just to accompany a publication, but actually to provide kind of a sandbox for people to be able to play around and truly, democratize access to data for the cognitive sciences. And that is something that we remain interested in and want to work toward. We need to make sure that the data set or sets that we share would actually be useful. So I think it's, we need to make sure that we're getting the right feedback on what that data set or data sets would look like. But I think that's a great point, and that's a direction that we're working in. I'll bring up, I've been intrigued by things like, so Kaggle. Kaggle is a site that has data sets that are available, and even companies can sponsor competitions for data scientists to dig through data and present some findings. So that's an interesting model. We haven't used that yet, although we've been thinking in those directions as well. So I'd be very interested to hear other ideas on how we might make these data sets more available and actually be able to field requests for what types of data would be most helpful for researchers.
Bob, any reactions to that, Mark?
Yeah, I think the Kaggle is an interesting model. So we all know about the Netflix competition, right? That's a famous example of a lot of people involved in addressing one problem that Netflix was working with. I guess I'm a little bit skeptical though of focusing entirely on this competition model. I think industry might not be aware of the types of people that are drawn to these kinds of competitions because it's not basic researchers. Very few of my colleagues are interested in Kaggle. They don't want to solve the company's problem. They want to solve, a basic research problem. And so if it's framed in terms of a competition, and it's usually a very specific sort of problem, a target domain, I'm not sure if you're going to get the visibility that you're looking for. So I still don't quite know what that model should be or should look like, but I hope there's maybe a better way to connect Open Science Foundation, let's say, with industry, that industry realizes, okay, you can get a lot of visibility from a lot of people by just publishing this data on Open Science Foundation. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Mark. Well, why don't I bring back Jules and Danny, and you guys can help us to kick off the Q&A to our participants. I see we've got about 6 questions here in the Q&A in the chat, but let's push this to you guys if you'd like to kick this off.
Let me pluck out the one about the identification, because to some degree that's sort of the gating barrier for a lot of organizations that have said, you know, well, I don't share personal information, or and there's obviously critiques of the challenges of de-identification. The Netflix, you know, competition drew, you know, some critique, or, you know, around that, whether fair or not. It's obviously one of the areas. How did you guys, given this particular data set, look at de-identification? How big of a technical or hurdle was that? You know, with what granularity does the data here get shared for those who are putting on their, you know, privacy and data protection hats?
Right. Well, for this particular collaboration, the data requested and the data necessary to answer these questions actually, I'd say, was relatively easier than for some other projects or for some other data sets. So in this case, you know, the information about the users who are generating this data were primarily high-level demographic data points. So age, education level, gender. You know, there are other projects that are very interesting that might want to use the Lumosity data set to, let's say, merge that data with other data sets, join it to something, let's say, to look at location-based, you know, differences in socioeconomics in different locations, or anything from air quality to, you know, well, various questions that would require joining our data set with others. And so I think that's where some of the stickier situations come in. And so, you know, let's say the safe harbor de-identification methods provide some guidance around, let's say, the geolocation one. If we were to provide the location of users, you know, it provides guidance around using 3-digit zip codes and kind of removing any sensitive 3-digit zip codes, remapping them. And so there are some nice, there's nice guidance that's already in place there. Admittedly, there are more complex products and platforms than ours. We don't have an element of, you know, tweeting or having a social post or something like that. And so we are fortunately in a somewhat simpler world than a Facebook or a Twitter or you know, something that has more of a social public profile for each user. And so I can't speak to the efforts around de-identification for those very well.
Great.
Let me kick a question over here to Mark real quick. So other than the size of the data that you were able to gather from Lumosity, what other sort of advantages may there be to working with a corporation in terms of accessing some of their data? So one of our participants has asked things such that, for example, like, are you paid for conducting this research or for doing sort of external analytics for this company? But beyond questions like payment, what advantages are there to you as a researcher for approaching these types of partnerships?
Sorry, and part of the question is about payment, or?
Yes,
So,
yeah.
So dealing with the scale data does present challenges. So the computer that's humming away next to me in my office does a good job, but it's not sufficient to deal with some of the problems. So we had to use, you know, Amazon clusters to solve some of the computational issues. That does cost money. I had no idea how much money that would cost, but yeah. So that's an interesting thing to think about. Yeah, so it's the scale that's really interesting, but it's also the type of data that you get that becomes available. You're looking more at real world problems, right? We tend to, certainly in cognitive psychology, we tend to simplify an experimental task such that, you know, we control all the factors about timing, and so we have very tight experimental control to answer basic scientific questions. Much of that goes out the door when you have these real world sort of naturally occurring data sets. And so some of my colleagues, they're skeptical, like, well, there's too many confounding factors. Like, how do you know what's really going on in the data? And my answer to that is we need to build better tools, better theoretical frameworks to understand the potential for these confounds, right? People choosing things as opposed to being assigned to some condition. And I think that leads to sort of a new, new types of theories that we haven't thought about before, certainly in my domain in cognitive psychology.
One question calls out, how do you make the case to a company that it's worth the risk or the expense? And I guess I'd venture one answer. You give awards like this, you take ads in the New York Times, you applaud as socially valuable and meritorious. But I think I'd also maybe point to, the CEOs of the business roundtable, the, top corporations in America recently posed that they were updating, the definition of what is a corporation and going beyond that a corporation simply maximizes value of stockholders. And they said, no, you actually have stakeholders, you have employees, you have the communities you work in, you have this broader set of audiences that you are also, beholden to, that you're supposed to be doing something to. And I think around the country, we all hopefully are recognizing that the impact that we have on our communities. And if you're a company that is holding a data set that has incredible scientific potential, the research community, the academic community is one of your stakeholders. Your science, although perhaps applied, is built on the shoulders of advances. And you've got some responsibility, we'd argue, to contribute back to that community. And some companies might do that by, having research academic arms and so forth, because they can support that. But for many who don't, this is clearly one way that you can be a contributor to that broader social and stakeholder value. But I think it's incumbent upon all of us in foundation world, in academic world, in corporate world, in broader social responsibility world, to make that case. I think we do need to be aware that there are people who will say, we don't want to see, corporate ethics data washing, right? And so if the point is that a company is involved in some practice that's controversial, and then they say, well, hey, I'm going to now also donate the data to you, of course, that's going to be treated skeptically. But I think responding to the actual needs of researchers who are studying, maybe even studying, how your company works, studying, the effects of data on society, or are generating the scientific problems that they are developing, I think there's really a path there where you can see the mutual altruism. And if we can minimize some of the friction and support the tools that make this work in a smooth way, I think it is indeed one of the highest social benefits that a company can provide to an important stakeholder community. But they do need to appreciate that that is one of their communities. That's a community knocking on the door saying, I'm trying to, fix problems in the world. I'm trying to advance science. You can help me. Why won't you? And simply saying that, well, there's some friction or it might take some time, when you might be the key source of knowledge, I think really is, is something that we need to support.
And I might add to that. I like thinking about that as, this is an important stakeholder. I think beyond that for us, so through the HCP, through the Human Cognition Project, so we do not pay the researchers in there. We support through providing access to our software and data, but clearly this is, we are trying to provide support so that independent researchers can do research independently. And in some cases, we'll have a more active collaboration. But I think for us, we do have a small research team internally, but we are a small team and we have bottlenecks and resource limitations. And if we truly wanted to do all of the things that we want to do, it would be impossible with such a small team. And so we're counting on the research community to do interesting work that we would never be able to get around to, or that we just simply don't have the expertise to do. And so actually just thinking beyond your organization, think about what you hope the research community, how you want the research community to be able to move forward in that field. and think beyond your organization and actually think about maybe it's a better opportunity to have other people driving forward some of that research, and you can be in more of a supporting role.
Great, thanks. Let me ask one question that came in from the Q&A. And this, Mark, you may be able to say something about this given your humming computer there. Are you using anything about with differential privacy in order to be able to, when you're addressing these data sets? Or Bob, are you at Lumosity and Lumos Labs, are you applying differential privacy techniques in the transformation of the data before you share it?
So we've not used those techniques. I think the fields that we accessed are quite limited. So I don't think there's a concern there. Although, yeah, I did force myself to learn about privacy techniques. So I actually started to teach a course in computational social science where we learned about some of the horrible things that can go wrong when you start to fuse data and release data, you know, with all the good intentions, and then you discover that somebody can reverse engineer those individuals that go into the data. So, but we had not had to resort to those techniques.
Thank you. All right. Well, we are here at 2:58, and we are scheduled to be done at 3 o'clock. So any comments, Danny? Any last comments, Jules?
Danny, final thought from you before I close?
Just congratulations to everyone. Keep up the good work, and know that there are funders out there who are interested in seeing this kind of research go forward, and who are interested in trying to reduce those frictions and put together institutions that can help minimize the transaction costs.
For anybody out there in the corporate world that's following or listening, if you've got the kind of data sets that may be of value, and there's somebody, frankly, doing scientific research that probably is interested in learning something, and you're worried about any of the friction or risk or the like, please be in touch. We're happy to help you think these things through. We have an interesting project that takes a look at some of the ethics, given that some of these projects may go through corporate academic IRBs and so forth. Others may not, and certainly helping provide the ethical assessment. Is this a project that makes sense? We didn't have a chance to really get into that today. I think is also an adjacent important step that can help advance this. So kudos, Mark, Bob, kudos to Lumos, kudos to the real advance and the useful learning that came from your project. We congratulate you. And if you're on the academic side and you're working and are interested in connecting with companies, we welcome hearing from you as well. Sarah, you're going to close on next steps, and we'll let you all get to your next Zoom call.
Absolutely. So our next round of awards, the nomination forms will come up live on November 15th. We are also soliciting applications for reviewers. If you'd like to see some of these interesting things that are going on, please pay attention to data.fpf.org in the future to find out more about this previous award and our upcoming awards for the next year. Thank you.
Congrats. Thanks, Danny, for helping make this happen. Thanks to all of you.
Thank you.
Everyone.